Hello and welcome to the Brigham Young University Hawaii online economics course. Today we're talking about Chapter 29, Investments and Economic Growth. The learning objectives for our first section are going to be to discuss the components of the investment spending category of GDP and distinguish between gross and net investment. Remember, the components of GDP are C, which is consumption, plus I, which is investment, plus G, which is government spending, plus X, which is net exports. So today we'll hit the discussion on investments. Number two, to discuss the relationship between consumption, saving, and investment, and explain the relationship using the production possibilities curve or model that we learned in the earlier part of the class. If you were to look at the components for investment, you probably wouldn't be surprised by the fact that you have a stacked graph here where at the very bottom is non-residential structures, commercial office buildings, things like that. Then you have non-residential equipment and software. Equipment would be computers that you use at your workplace, software that you use at your workplace. All those things are included in investments here. Then you have residential, so residential investments, your home. Then you have this sort of small and fluctuating piece up here, which is the changes in inventories. Firms often have inventories for products that they're selling. That number or the amount of inventories is very volatile. And as you can see from the graph, it becomes positive and negative at various times in the economic cycle. So changes in public inventories are a component of investment. Together, all these four constitute the investment category that we calculate in GDP. However, what's important to differentiate is the difference between gross investment and net investment. And the difference is largely depreciation. So if you were to look at your gross domestic investment and a net domestic investment, the difference between those is a concept called depreciation. And for those of you who are not necessarily accounting minded, it's difficult to get your hands around this sometimes, so I'm going to use a very practical example. Let's suppose that you go out today and you buy a car. The car is brand new. It has that brand new smell, has the leather smell inside, drives perfectly. There are absolutely no problems with it. And you're expecting that you'll probably own this car for 5 years. So you drive it for the first year and everything is just great. Now the second year, it's a little bit worn. Very little, but a little bit worn. And so it's a different car than it was the first year that you bought it when it was all brand new. That difference reflects its usability as well. Perhaps it can't go as fast. Perhaps the tires are wearing out and are going to need to be replaced soon. Maybe the brakes are starting to fault. Maybe the windshield wipers need to be replaced. This change in what was a new car and fully functional and needing no repair to a year later in a car that's still in good shape but needs some adjustments to its value because of the wear and tear is called depreciation. So the difference between what the car was like brand new and what the car was like a year later, that wear and tear, that use, is called depreciation. And so we want to make sure that we reflect well the idea of depreciation in our investments. Because even though we bought the car new a year ago, the next year its value is not as high as it was when we first bought it. And the difference is just reflected as depreciation. What's interesting about investment is how very volatile it is. If you were to look at government purchases over time, you can see that it moves around a little bit, but not a lot. In addition, personal consumption also moves around a little bit, but not a lot. And that's probably fairly easy to understand that, we still need to buy food even during poor economic times, and we still need to drive to work. We still need to replace things. And so this personal consumption number really doesn't move around. But when you look at investment, it seems to be all over the map on this graph. Investment is extremely sensitive to economic conditions and consequently to changes in the business cycle. Investment is very, very volatile. And some of the reasons for that volatility will be discussed here in just a minute. Let's talk about something that Warren Buffett would be really anxious for all students in the university to understand. If you were to consider how we arrive at investment numbers, we can use the production possibilities curve to get us there. Here we have a situation where let's just assume that this first and inner production possibilities curve, labeled PPC3, is where we are. As a civilization, as an economy, we are on this curve. And on the curve we have consumption per period over here, and we have investment per period over here. So we have two choices. We can either consume here, or we can invest our money. And this curve, as you remember from previous chapters, just represents the trade-off between consumption and investment. Now, if we consume 100% of our income, in other words, if we're over here, we're consuming 100% of our income, we're investing nothing. If we come down over here and we invest 100% of our incomes, we're consuming nothing. And that's not very likely. But consumption in the United States and in the U.S. economy is an extremely large component of our GDP. Remember, GDP accounts for C, which is consumption, plus I, which is investment, plus G, which is government spending, plus net exports. So this trade-off that we're focusing on here is just the trade-off between consumption and investment. The problem is, if we consume everything we make, consume our full income buying stuff for ourselves, there's no money left for investment. And the reality is we can never grow from this inner production possibilities curve to a bigger economy represented by this outer production possibilities curve unless we forego some consumption today and invest. Called the paradox of thrift. And the paradox is, if we move towards full consumption, towards making some investment and less consumption, we're going to slow down the economy because we're not consuming as much and putting some of that money into our investments. However, that trade-off allows us to move from this inner production possibilities curve to the outer production possibilities curve over time. Because that investment that we make, because we didn't consume as much, can now be put into expanding our factories, buying more cars, employing more people, various other things that makes us be able to produce more. And producing more is actually very important, because if we don't produce more, then the immigrants that come into our country won't have jobs, the children that we have won't have jobs, our ability to continually grow our profession, do more things, expand ourselves won't be there as well. So investment is a very critical component of the future of any economy. And you can measure the ability of an economy to grow by how much they invest. Historically, the United States has been a very, very investing economy. That is changing now because we have less discretionary income to be able to invest with, and now our savings rate has dropped to where it's almost negative. And so we need to think what that decision is going to do for us in the long term by investing less and consuming more. But the trade-off is very clear from this production possibilities curve. So today, in section 2, we're going to talk about the determinants of investment. We're going to throw investment into a demand curve and see if we can use the demand curve to better understand it. So we're going to draw his hypothetical investment demand curve, explain what it shows about the relationship between investment and the interest rate, and we're going to discuss the factors that can cause an investment demand curve to shift. So first and foremost, the investment demand curve is a curve that shows the quantity of investment that's demanded at each interest rate, all other determinants of investment unchanged, or ceteris paribus. So let's throw this curve up here and see if we can't make sense of it. Here we have the quantity demanded of investment on the x-axis, On the y-axis, we have interest rate. This is exactly the same as we did in the earlier chapters on supply and demand, where we had price up here and quantity here. In the case of investments, the price is the interest rate, the amount of return that you're getting on your investment. The quantity is the amount of dollars that you're going to invest. And the relationship seems to make some sense, because we can look at this and say, well, at 6%, there's going to be X amount of investment demanded. At 8%, there's going to be Y amount. Okay, let's talk about the kind of things that change this, that change the determinants of demand, the things that shift the curve. One is in expectations. If you have certain expectations about the future, then if you think the economy is going to grow in the future, you're more likely to invest at all rates more today. So your demand curve for investments is going to shift to the right. You're going to expand the amount of investments that you're going to do. The level of economic activity is closely tied to this. In times of economic growth, we tend to invest more. In times of economic recession, we tend to invest less. The stock of capital, the amount of capital that is currently existing in the market, is also a key determinant of investment demand. If there is very little stock of capital and there's more demand for growth, then there will be an increase in investment demand. Capacity utilization is another interesting one. You may remember from our previous discussions that capacity utilization can be expressed as a percentage of your total capacity. So if you think about two companies, one is operating at 50% of its total capacity, the other one is operating at 90% of its total capacity. The one that's operating at 90% of capacity is more likely to invest for growth than the one operating at 50%, because they're almost full. They're going to need a new facility. So capacity utilization has a significant impact on the demand for investment. The cost of capital goods also has an impact. In the United States, we make a lot of capital goods in this country, but we also import a lot from places like Germany. So if the cost of capital goods in Germany goes up, it's now more expensive for us to buy investment goods, then our demand for those investment goods are probably going to fall. Other factor costs, for example, things like labor. If labor is going to rise significantly, then we're probably less likely to make investments that are going to use or factor in labor as a component of those costs. So we'd more likely move towards things like robotics and things like that if labor is going to rise. So different factor costs and how those factor costs move around has a significant impact. Technological change, things that we can do differently using technology, also impact our demand for investments. If things can be done much more efficiently using new equipment, then we're likely to make an investment in new equipment faster. And then public policy. Sometimes the federal government will say, you know what, you guys get to depreciate for tax purposes all your equipment expenses very quickly. That kind of a policy change will make it so that people are more likely to invest, more likely to buy more new trucks, more equipment, things like that. So here we are in the final run on this chapter, section 3. The learning objectives here are to explain how investments affects aggregate demand and to explain how investment affects economic growth. And it's probably fairly simple. In the case of investment interest rates, just consider that if you are a consumer, a demander of capital, and the capital price drops, so in this case the price, remember, is the interest rate. Now the price for capital, the price for investment funds goes from 8% to 6%. Whenever the price of anything goes down, the demand for it increases, and you can see that indeed what happens is the price for capital goes down, the price for investment drops, and our demand goes from 950 to 1,000. And that's practically what happens in the real world. Businesses are constantly looking at the cost of capital, the cost of making an investment. And as interest rates fall, the demand for those investments will rise. This has a direct impact on aggregate demand. Because remember, if interest rates fall and demand for capital increases, I'm going to take that capital and then I'm going to put it into the economy, and I'm going to buy equipment. I'm going to buy trucks. I'm going to buy these various other things, which causes our aggregate demand curve here to shift outwards. Now we're going to be demanding more goods. So what's important to understand in conclusion here is that investment adds to the capital stock. Because once we get capital in our hands in dollars, we're going to do something with that money. We're going to invest it. We're going to use it to expand our property and expand our plant, modernize our systems, and all of that adds to the capital stock. An increase in the capital stock leads to an outward shift in the production possibilities curve. Remember, we shifted from the inner line to the outer line, which shows that we can actually make more product at any given price because of our capacity to produce has increased. This allows for more consumption. As the production possibilities curve shifts out, we can move towards more consumption. We can also move towards more investment. But this increase in consumption drives economic growth. Because remember, economic growth or economic GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So we increase the capital stock. Capital stock leads to an outward shift in the production possibility curve. That leads to increased consumption. Increased consumption is one of the driving and motivating factors of an increase in economic growth. Consequently, the long-run aggregate supply curve also shifts to the right. And the reason why this occurs is now that you have more capital or more ability to supply, your average cost of supply has dropped, and so your supply curve shifts to the right, and your aggregate supply is now expanded. The increase in investments also increases aggregate demand. Now this is fairly straightforward, but we just mentioned it on the previous slide, that an increase of investment, once we make the investment, we're increasing aggregate demand by now saying, well, the investment's going to purchasing a truck, it's going to purchase a new robotic system, a new computer, new software. Any of those things are going to increase our aggregate demand. That's the end of this chapter. Remember, there's study groups on Wednesday nights, 9 o'clock in the GCB, but also recall that if you have any questions, you're always free to email me or call me, and I'd be happy to try and answer them.